शंकर हरे भव बांधते रो जटाजूट जटाजूट
Welcome to India by the Bay's ongoing digital series for 2022. This is our 5th episode, and we're delighted to present Richard Allen and Ira Bhaskar in conversation with Kismet Singh, exploring Bollywood, Bombay Cinema, and Islamicate Histories. Kismet, over to you.
We're so excited to welcome you today to what we hope is one of many conversations with India by the Bay. Joining me today are Richard Allen and Ira Bhaskar to discuss their book, Bombay Cinema's Islamicate Histories. The book gathers a group of leading scholars to explore the traditions of this culture in the subcontinent and the ways in which it permeates and informs the cinema of Bombay, now known as Bollywood. Richard is acting dean and chair professor at the School of Creative Media at City University of Hong Kong. His research interests as a scholar began in the areas of film theory and philosophy, moving on to film poetics and aesthetics. He's an internationally renowned scholar of Alfred Hitchcock and has worked extensively on Hindi cinema as well. Ira is professor of cinema studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She's lectured extensively at home and abroad. She has published extensively as well. Her research interests include historical poetics, melodrama, literature and film, and historical trauma, violence, memory, and representation. So to get right to it, this is for both of you. Tell us a bit about how both of you came together to edit this book and just how the idea was born.
So this came together through, initially, I think, through the fact that I was asked to do a festival of film at NYU Abu Dhabi. NYU, I was a professor at NYU at the time, and NYU Abu Dhabi, NYU was proposing to set up a new campus in Abu Dhabi. And they wanted some pre-university events to set up a footprint there, and asked me to curate a film festival. And I wanted to do something meaningful there. Of course, I could have done, say, Hitchcock, but I had become familiar with the Muslim tradition of Indian cinema partly through Ira, of course, who was a student at NYU, where she did a PhD. And I thought that this could be a great opportunity to bring the Arab culture in the Emirates together with the large South Asian culture. So this is where initially the idea of this a festival based around the Islamic influence on Indian cinema came about. Following that, I approached Ira to collaborate on this. And in that context, we together organized a conference on the topic where we invited many scholars funded by NYU Abu Dhabi, to Abu Dhabi, scholars and also filmmakers and other people, critics. And so we organized this conference. Ultimately, the book is a product of that.
And I just want to add a little bit to what Richard has already told you about the festival, and which was very sort of exciting for us. And interestingly, the majority of the audience in Abu Dhabi, and then the festival moved to New York and was a year later, and it was It ran at the Lincoln Film Center in New York. And the point I want to make is that the majority of the audience for the films in that festival were Pakistanis. And the reason I'm making this point is precisely the fact that the kind of Islamicate histories that we're talking about are South Asian histories, and that they're shared between India and Pakistan, particularly India and Pakistan, because of the Urdu language. And not so much Bangladesh, though there are Islamicate traditions there as well. And the Pakistani audiences, I mean, members of the audiences who were Pakistani or were of Pakistani origin, were very, very excited about the films. And I'm sure they would really also respond, the academics among them would respond to this book as well. So I think this book brings together, the shared traditions of the Islamicate in India and Pakistan.
Speaking of that diversity, there's so much to dig into the book. I felt like each chapter could be a conversation. So trying to just sort of get into a little bit of it. Ira, one part of the book talks about this aesthetic sensibility of the Urdu language and how it was cultivated by Parsi theatre, and then how that shaped Bombay cinema. And how did that, as the book says, become a cornerstone of the Islamicate idiom in Bombay cinema?
So that's absolutely right. And I think it's really important to make the point here that Urdu is an Indian language. It didn't come from other, sort of cultures in West Asia, for instance. Urdu was born in India, and it was born in India before the Parsi theatre, that is, through the amalgamation of Persian, Arabic, what is known as Hindavi, Khari Boli, and other kinds of linguistic registers like Braj and Avadhi, and so on in North India. And it was a language that emerged in the bazaars, the markets, and the military encampments in northern India. And through the 18th century and end of the 18th century, and certainly in the 19th century, Urdu emerged with the influence of Dakhani, which was a similar kind of bringing together of languages. It emerged as an extremely poetic and high cultural language, as well as the language of the people, as well as the bazaar language. Interestingly, today, the language that is spoken in North India and in Pakistan, that language is Hindustani or Urdu. It's the same language, it has different names, which is why we can understand the telenovelas and the series that are broadcast on Pakistani television, because it's the same language. And that comes to us with a shock of recognition. Urdu was chosen to be the language of the Parsi theatre, which is also a point to remember, because the Parsis had amalgamated into the Indian context and had taken on Gujarati as their language. So the Parsis speak Gujarati, but the Parsi stage, which emerged in the late 19th century, actually opted for Urdu as a language that was understood widely across the subcontinent. And so the plays, the Parsi plays, the plays for the Parsi stage began to be written in Urdu. And they also, it was very hybrid as a form, and it brought together the poetic traditions of Urdu, both in terms of literary forms as well as in terms of musical forms and performative idioms. So ghazals and different kinds of song forms. And I'm not sure that the Qawwali was actually ever on the Parsi stage. That needs some research, but the ghazal certainly was. And the dialogue, the sort of emotional registers and the high flown. So when the play was a historical, for instance, the registers would move towards very high flown Persian and Arabic registers, especially Persian. And if it was a romance or a comedy, then the registers would be more sort of spoken Urdu and Hindustani. So that's how Urdu, that's the history of Urdu. And the reason why it entered Bombay cinema is because the Parsi stage, the plays of Parsi theatre were adapted for film when sound came to India to Indian cinemas in 1931. And a lot of the some, lyricists and dramatists, etc., entered Bombay cinema. And that's how Urdu became the main language of Bombay cinema from 1931 onwards.
You touched on historical films, and Richard, I wanted to ask you as well. There's a whole chapter in the book about them. How did these historical films become this whole genre? It sort of played a crucial ideological function in the period from the 40s in India to about the 1960s, didn't it?
Well, yeah, of course, the interpretation of history is in popular culture has always been critical to the ways in which communities and populations understand themselves, and in the lead up to independence, of course, in the resistance to the British, one of the roles that especially the Muslim theme historical played was to articulate a conception of justice that was indigenous to the Indian context, or to the broader South Asian context. Because of course, one of the struggles in terms of the independence movement was with a British colonial government that had self-evidently implemented double standards in relationship to the conception of justice and fairness in the colonial theatre. So the historicals like Bhaskar, which is a chapter on in the book, were extremely important. A Muslim themed historical, especially around Jahangir, Jahangir's famous chain of justice. These were important in articulating an indigenous a tradition of jurisprudence. And then in the post-independence period, the historical begins to take on a different function. And here it's in films like Mughalism. Here it's about looking to the Mughal Imperium as actually providing an exemplary context for the comity and the amity between Muslims and Hindus.
Ira, I wanted to talk about your chapter a little bit. You talk about the Sufi sacred, the Qawwali, and the songs of Bombay cinema, and how this sort of central Sufi idea of single-minded devotion to the loved one, how is that at the core of many iconic films of Bombay cinema?
With the coming of Muslim invaders from Muslim merchants, and also invaders from the initially the 8th century and then from the 11th, 12th century onwards, while that is one arc of the arrival of Muslims in the subcontinent, the other is the Sufis and the Sufi mystics. And the Sufis brought with them forms of interaction and forms of relationship which were easy for the indigenous populations of South Asia to relate to. So the idea of devotion and the idea of single-minded commitment to the loved one and to the beloved, interpreted initially as the divine being, is central to Sufi poetry, and has been then seen to also stand in for the beloved, because the divine being is your ultimate beloved. So this idea of Sufi poetry and the kind of lyricism, the kind of enrapturement, that it produced, is central to the songs of Bombay cinema, because the idea of love, and this comes not just from the Sufi tradition, it also comes from the Bhakti tradition. So this is where Indian Sufism is different from Sufism anywhere else in the world. And so both the Sufi traditions and the Bhakti traditions actually have at the center the idea of the lover as the divine being. and the beloved as the divine being.
Ira, when did you know that you were meant to be an educator, be it teaching cinema or literature, which you've done both of? And in your daughter's words, something I found online, that education empowers and liberates.
Well, I mean, I don't think I can mark a beginning because it was always so. I mean, as a young girl growing up in Patna, we used to go every weekend to watch a Hindi film at the theater, and I was fascinated. And during my college years, I started a film society at LSR. And at that time, this was during the 70s, and 70s was the peak of the Indian New Wave. And so I showed all the Indian New Wave films and also French New Wave and Italian films and, international cinemas of all kinds, Soviet cinemas and so on. But so film was a fascination for me, and I wanted to study it. I was studying English, but there was no place in India where I could actually study cinema. And hence I continued with English and decided that for my PhD, I would definitely work on cinema. And I continued my engagement with cinemas, different kinds of cinemas, through my student years, and also in the time that I was faculty member in the English department. And then from there I went to NYU for my PhD. So I always knew that I was interested in literature, I was interested in cinema, and and these are interests that have stayed with me. And for me today, the cinema of today that is being produced, of course, I know the Bombay cinema, the Hindustani language cinema that comes out of Bombay, now known as Bollywood, best. But I also have an interest in Bengali cinemas and more recently South Indian cinemas. And I see, because of my interest in melodrama, I see the connections between these different kinds of forms and different kinds of cinematic traditions across India.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you so much, both Ira and Richard, for your time. This could be many, many conversations, and I hope you'll join us again on Conversations with India by the Bay. But thank you for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Kismet.